Rustlers had left him for dead, roped upright to a blackened cottonwood at the mouth of the box canyon, and the buzzards had already begun their slow gyre against the noon sky when Ivy Marsh reined in her mare and did not look away. She had come out to Rincon Canyon for nothing more than a lost milk cow, and she had found instead a man she never thought to see helpless in her life. Doll Prentice hung against the rope with his chin on his chest, his shirt torn to ribbons, his face swollen dark on one side, and for one long, terrible moment Ivy thought she had come too late. Then his chest rose, a shallow breath but a breath. She was down off the mare before she had decided to be, her skirts bunched in one fist, her boots skidding on the loose shale. She had not spoken to Doll Prentice in 8 months, not since the morning he had stood on the porch of his own house and told her, without a shred of proof, that she was no longer welcome on his land. He had believed his foreman's word over hers. He had not even asked her to explain. She remembered every particular of that morning still. The way the porch boards had creaked under his boots, the way he had not quite met her eyes, the way Cobb had stood off to one side with his arms crossed, and a look on his face she had not understood then and understood now only too well. She had walked the 4 miles back to town with her few belongings in a flour sack and her pride in pieces, had scrubbed other women's linens through a hard, lean winter to keep a roof over her own head, and she had promised herself she would never again waste a single thought on Doll Prentice. And yet here she was, cutting the rope from his wrists with the little knife she carried for snakes, because whatever he had done to her, she was not the kind of woman who could ride away from a dying man and sleep that night. Mr. Prentice. She caught him as the rope gave, and he was heavier than she expected, all long bone and dead weight, and she staggered under him and lowered him as gently as she could into the canyon's thin shade. "Doll, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered. One eye was swollen shut, the other found her face and struggled to make sense of it. "Ivy," he rasped, as though her name cost him something to say, "you oughtn't be here." "No," she agreed, already working the buttons of his shirt to see how bad the ribs were. "I oughtn't." He had been beaten with fists and a quirt, not a blade, and for that she was grateful, because a whipped man could mend where a cut man might not. His ribs were bruised, maybe cracked, his lip split, one eye swollen to a slit, his wrists rubbed raw and bleeding where the rope had held him upright for what she guessed was the better part of a day and a night. His lips were cracked too, from thirst, and she gave him water from her canteen in small, careful sips, tipping it against his mouth the way she might have tended a fevered child, and did not let herself think too long on how gentle the act felt after everything that had passed between them. Rustlers, he told her in pieces between gritted breaths, had hit the herd at Willow Bend 3 nights back, and when he'd ridden out alone to track them they had been waiting, 6 of them, and they had taken his horse, his rifle, and nearly his life, and left him roped to the tree as an example to any other rancher fool enough to come after his own cattle. "They'll be back," he said, "for the rest of the herd, tonight likely when the moon's down. Then we haven't got till tonight to sit here feeling sorry for ourselves." Ivy tore a strip from her own petticoat and began binding his ribs, her hands steady even though her heart was not. "Can you stand?" "I can stand." He could not without her shoulder under his arm, but he tried, and she let him lean on her because a man like Doll Prentice needed to believe he was still a man even flat on his back in a canyon, and she understood that about him better than she wanted to admit. She got him onto her mare, which was no small trick with him half senseless and her skirts tangling at every turn, and she led the horse on foot the 2 miles to the line shack that sat at the canyon's western lip, the closest shelter she knew of. By the time she had him inside and laid on the shack's single cot, her arms shook with the effort and her palms were raw from the lead rope, but Doll Prentice was breathing steadier, and that was the only accounting she cared to make. She built a small fire, boiled water, and cleaned the wounds at his wrists and the gash above his eye with a clean cloth, and he watched her work in a silence that had nothing sullen in it, only a kind of stunned gratitude he did not seem to have words for yet. "Why," he said finally when she had finished and sat back on her heels, "would you do this? After what I did to you?" Ivy did not answer right away. She wrung out the cloth and hung it to dry over the chair back, and when she spoke her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. "Because I know what it is to be left for something I didn't do, Mr. Prentice, and I couldn't leave a man to die of it, whatever he'd done to me." "You should hate me." "I did some," she said, "for a while." He closed his good eye. "Cobb told me you'd been skimming the household accounts. He had a ledger, showed me figures. I never once asked you for your side of it. His jaw worked. I just believed the man who'd worked for me 11 years over the woman who'd kept my house 8 months because it was easier and because I was tired and because I didn't want to think hard about who I trusted. That's the truth of it. There's no dressing it up prettier than that." "No," Ivy agreed, "there isn't." "I'm sorry, Ivy. I've been sorry near every day since. I asked around town twice, meaning to make it right, and both times my nerve failed me before I got as far as your door. I told myself it was pride kept me from it, but I think now it was shame, plain and simple, and shame is a poor excuse for leaving a wrong unmended." She looked at him a long moment. This big battered man laid low in a lined shack, stripped of every hardness she remembered in him, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched tight for 8 months. She had pictured this reckoning 100 different ways through that hard winter, had imagined herself cold and unmoved, or triumphant, or simply walking away without a word. She had never once imagined it would feel like this, like setting down a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was a weight at all. "We'll talk it through proper," she said, "when you're not bleeding on my petticoat. Right now you need to rest, and I need to think what we're going to do about 6 rustlers coming back for the rest of your herd." He tried to sit up at that, wincing. "You'll take the horse and ride for town. Fetch the sheriff, fetch anybody. I won't have you here when they come. The sheriff's 2 hours off if he's even in his office, and the herd will be gone and you likely dead again before help ever arrives." Ivy said it plainly, the way she said most things, without flinching from the truth of a hard situation. "I grew up on my father's place before it failed, Mr. Prentice. I can handle a rifle, though I notice yours is presently in a rustler's saddle scabbard. But there's a shotgun over that door, unless I miss my guess, and a man who keeps a lined shack usually keeps it loaded." He almost smiled, though it clearly hurt his split lip to do it. "Loaded, behind the flour tin." She found it exactly where he said, checked the load with hands that did not shake though her stomach did, and set it within reach. The afternoon wore down slow and gold across the canyon walls, and Ivy used the hours to make Dal eat a little of the jerked beef she carried in her saddlebag, to check his bindings, to let him talk when he wanted to talk and be silent when silence was easier. And somewhere in that long waiting the last of the coldness she had carried against him for 8 months simply wore away, the way frost wears off a fence rail once the sun climbs high enough. He was not the careless, credulous man who had turned her out. Or he was that man, but he was also a man capable of looking straight at his own failing and naming it, and Ivy had learned there was no rarer thing in this world than that. "When this is done," he said, as the light began to slant long and red through the canyon mouth, "if you'll have me hear it, I want to tell the whole town what I did to you, and what a fool I was to do it. I want your name clean of Cobb's lie in every mouth that ever heard it." "We'll see it done," she told him, "once you're not lying in a lined shack with your ribs strapped together." He caught her hand before she could rise. His grip was weak, but it held. "I mean more than clearing your name, Ivy. I mean I don't want you riding out of this canyon and out of my life again. I've had 8 months to know what an empty house feels like without you keeping it, and it isn't the accounts I missed." She felt the heat climb her throat and did not trust herself to answer that yet, not with rustlers still to come and a wounded man's fever still to watch for. "Rest," she said instead, gentler than the word required, and did not pull her hand away. The moon went down a little after 10, exactly as he had warned, and it was in that black hour, with only starlight silvering the canyon rock, that Ivy heard the horses. She was at the shack's single window in an instant, the shotgun heavy and sure in her hands, watching six shapes ride down into the canyon toward the last of the penned cattle in the box corral below. She counted them by their voices carrying flat across the stone, rough and careless, men who believed they had left no one behind capable of trouble. Her mouth had gone dry as chalk, and her hands, for all her steady talk to Doll, trembled faintly against the stock until she made herself stop and breathe and remember every lesson her father had ever drilled into her about a rifle and a cool head, back before the drought had taken his land and his spirit both. Ivy, Doll's voice was low behind her, urgent, and she heard him trying to rise from the cot and failing. "Stay down," she said, not turning. "You can't stand and you know it, and I won't have you falling in front of me and making noise enough to give us both away." She had one advantage they did not know she held, and she used it without hesitating. The shack sat above the corral on a shelf of rock, and the trail down to it ran through a narrow chute where a body could roll stone. She slipped out the door low and silent, found the loose slabs Doll had once complained needed clearing from the trail, and set her shoulder to the largest of them. It went down with a crash that filled the canyon like thunder, tumbling and splitting into a dozen smaller stones that clattered and bounced through the chute. And in the same breath she fired the shotgun once into the air above the rustlers' heads, the report cracking off the canyon walls until it sounded like 6 guns instead of 1. The effect was everything she had hoped. Startled horses reared and screamed in the dark. Men shouted over each other trying to make sense of gunfire and falling rock with no way to see where either had come from. And in the chaos 2 of the 6 went down hard when their mounts bolted out from under them. She fired again, deliberately wide, and heard a man yell that they were surrounded, that the rancher had brought half the county down on them. And within another minute the drum of retreating hooves was fading fast up the canyon's far trail, leaving the cattle milling loose but safe in the dark behind them. Ivy stood with the empty shotgun trembling now in her hands, her heart slamming, and let herself breathe. When she came back inside, Doll had dragged himself upright against the wall by main will, his face gray with the effort and the pain of it, but his eyes, when they found her, held something she had never once seen aimed at her in 8 months of working under his roof, plain, unguarded wonder. "You drove off 6 armed men," he said, "with a rock slide and 1 shotgun." "I drove off 6 men who never once got a clear look at what they were running from," Ivy said, setting the shotgun down and sinking, suddenly exhausted, onto the edge of the cot beside him. "That's a different thing than bravery, Mr. Prentice. That's only sense." "Call me Doll," he said. "After tonight I'd take it very hard if you called me anything else." She laughed a little shakily and found she could not stop the smile that came with it. "Doll, then." He reached for her hand again, and this time she let her fingers close around his without hesitation, and they sat together in the low firelight while outside the canyon settled back into its ordinary stillness, cattle lowing softly, the creek running on unbothered, as though it had not just witnessed a woman save the life of the man who had once cast her out without a hearing. "I meant what I said," Doll told her softly. "About the house. About wanting you back in it, not as a housekeeper this time, if you'll allow me to say it plain, as my wife, if you'll have such a battered, foolish man." Ivy looked at him a long moment, at the swollen eye and the split lip and the raw wrist she had bound herself, and thought of the 4 miles she had once walked back to town with her pride broken and her belongings in a flour sack, and how strange and how right it felt that the same road had led her back here, to this canyon, to this man, on her own 2 feet and by her own choosing. "I'll have you," she said, "battered, foolish, and all." The sheriff and 3 of Doll's own hands found them at first light, drawn by a boy Ivy had sent running for help the moment the rustlers' hoofbeats had faded for good. By then the fire had burned low and warm, the herd stood safe in the corral below, and Doll Prentice sat holding the hand of the woman he had wronged and who had ridden in any way, and did not let go of it, not once, while he told every man there exactly whose word ought to have been trusted 8 months before, and exactly whose word he trusted now, for the whole rest of his life. Within the week the sheriff ran Cobb to ground in a saloon 2 towns over, still carrying the ledger he had falsified, and by the next morning the whole of Rincon had the truth of what had happened to the woman they'd watched walk off Prentice land with a flour sack and nothing else. Dahl said it loud enough for every ear in the mercantile that Ivy Marsh had never taken a dishonest cent from him, that the fault had been entirely his own, and that he meant, if she'd still have him, to marry her before the first snow. Ivy stood beside him with her chin level and her eyes clear, and when he asked her plainly, in front of the whole watching town, whether she'd be his wife, she did not make him wait the way the town had once made her wait for justice. She said yes in the mercantile doorway, autumn light falling gold across them both, and thought that whatever the road out had cost her, it had brought her home again in a manner she would not trade.